to talk a little bit about design and tips and tricks, because I fall into this category, but I know that when I go to a garden center or a nursery, I am just wooed by everything that looks good. And so I randomly buy stuff that may not be the best choice for my local landscape. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you can incorporate these things into your own landscape and why it's so important to really think ahead and think about the process. And then we'll wrap up with perennials for your garden. A little bit of history about Colorado. We are unusual being a Western state. So Colorado is a very semi-arid state, and we only get about 8 to 15 inches of rain each year. Growing up in the Midwest, I'm from Minnesota and lived in Iowa and Ohio, where rain and snow just fall from the sky, it seems, all the time. Moving to the arid West was definitely a shift. Amy moved here from Kentucky just a couple years ago, and it's a very different growing environment. For us in Colorado, our water history and things has really proven to be an impact on how we landscape. And as people move to Colorado, as the secret's out, because Colorado is a great place to live, we're going to be putting more demand on our already limited water supply. But the great news is that a xeriscape landscape can really reduce your outdoor water use. And by reducing the outdoor water use, that means that you are doing your part to save water, but then you're also saving money, and that's a really big thing. So a well thought out xeriscape landscape plan can save you up to 60% on your own water use. So overall, Colorado, the 3% of our water that's used for landscapes gives us a huge return on investment. So in Colorado, when water originates in our state, 40% stays and 60% actually leaves. No, I got that wrong. No, that's right. Yes, so 60% leaves our state and 40% stays here. And so the entire population of Colorado is working with that 40% water use. And then of that 40%, 3% of that is then used for landscapes. And landscapes includes our golf courses and parks. It includes our own personal landscapes, sports complexes. And what I will say is that Coloradoans have done an awesome job over the last 10 years, and we alone have reduced our water use by about 20%. So we have adopted new technology, we have become smarter about our plant material, we are making sure that we're not watering the sidewalk and we're watering the lawn and all of those things. So we are doing our share, which is amazing. And that 3% water use is a huge part of what our community is comprised of. So obviously landscapes do a lot of good things for us. They make us feel good, it develops a neighborhood. Kids who spend time outdoors tend to have less behavioral issues. Obviously plants in general give us oxygen, they scrub carbon dioxide out of the air. And so for all of that, and this can be extrapolated nationwide, plants and landscapes and their ecosystems do a lot to support us. And so in the summer, it should be pointed out that of the household water budget, about 50% of your overall household water budget can be used for landscapes, and that's where then you can do your part to reduce some of those numbers and save money, because water is not getting any cheaper. So water is expensive, and it is important to use it wisely, and that's where plant selection comes into play. And having the right plants, having things hydrozoned appropriately, making sure that similar needs are on the same type of plant systems, those are all really important aspects in order to help reduce your overall household water budget. So xeriscape was coined by Denver Water a number of years ago, and it essentially means dry landscape. Now, when you think of a dry landscape, you might immediately go to rocks and cacti, and that's not what xeriscape is. In extension, we actually use the term water-wise landscaping because it actually then starts to incorporate a lot of plant material and flowers and color and fall color and all of those things. But the whole goal with xeriscape or water-wise landscaping is to have water savings within the landscape as a whole. Xeriscape, there are principles of Xeriscape, and part of Xeriscape is having a lawn that has a proper function. So Xeriscape doesn't mean you can't have your lawn. It doesn't mean that you can't have certain trees. It's just trying to overall conserve water throughout the entire landscape. So it doesn't have to be all rock. It doesn't have to be all cactus. This may be what you like. Perhaps you really, really, really enjoy this aspect, and that's totally fine. For me, being a Midwest girl, I really like trees and turf. I have to say, like, I just do. And so this, to me, is not a welcoming landscape. But depending on where you live and what you've grown up with, what you're used to, what your overall goals are for your own landscape, this may work. Instead, Xeriscape can be having flowers that bloom all season. It can be incorporating rock or hardscapes. It can be having great pollinator plants. Xeriscape can be a lot of different things, and there are some great gardens around the Colorado area and the Denver metro, up north, down south, that you can then take advantage of and look at for reference and for inspiration. Xeriscape can be long blooming plants, and so yarrows and some of the salvias bloom for weeks on end, which is really great. If you combine that with some of the foliage plants like ornamental grasses, you can really have a 4-season garden. And in Colorado, the winters can be a little bit bleak, and so having something to look at during January and February before we start getting some of those early spring blooming perennials, that is a good thing as well. So Xeriscape can mean a lot of different things, and it will depend on what you want it to be. There's also a number of plants that can have great fall color. And so Amy and Tony and I were talking before we admitted you to this presentation about what we want to do for our fall series. And so we talked about great plants with fall color. That could be one of those sessions. So stay tuned for that. You'll get notices from us about when those are available. When you're looking at landscape design, it is important to think about this carefully. So start with a site analysis, and it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It doesn't mean you have to go and get a drafting table and get out your markers. It could be just jotting some things down. What's important to your family? Where are the drainage problems in your landscape, if there are any? Where are the spigots? Is the area irrigated? Can it be irrigated? And think about your views and existing structures. So maybe you have a really ugly electric box in the back corner of your yard that you want to mask. That could be put on your site plan. Also think about how the space is used. Do you have young kids or grandkids that come over that need to use the space for soccer games? Or that you want to have an area for your dogs to run because you have 2 giant Great Danes that need the space. Also think about the traffic patterns. Think about areas that might need screening. Maybe you have a neighbor that you don't always want to look at when they're in the kitchen. And then take all of this information to make an overall plan. And you can continue to do this even if your landscape is established and you've been living in the house for 20 years. Your landscape is going to be a living involvement. It's never going to be stagnant. There's always going to be aspects that change year after year. When you finally get to the point of where you can start to select plants or maybe redo an aspect of a garden, it is important to think about how these plants are going to work in the overall ecosystem. So think about structure and texture and color. And one great tip that I had when I took a design class at Iowa State was take a photograph of your landscape in black and white. So if you have a smartphone, you can set the photograph to be black and white, and then look and see, are the textures all the same? Do you notice spiky plants? Are there plants with big leaves? You know, all of those things so that you have interest, not just based on color, but also the structure of plants too. And then you are going to have microclimates in your landscape. These are areas that are going to maybe be a little bit warmer, maybe a little bit cooler, and you will get to know those as you live in your home for longer periods of time. If you're in a brand new house, brand new landscape, you're not going to know a lot of those aspects. And so it does take some time to get to know your landscape and also the nuances that go along with it. When you do plant, it is so important to have the right plant in the right place. And so the classic example we love to use is the blue spruce that was planted next to the house 40 years ago, and oh my gosh, now the spruce has totally consumed the house and outgrown its boundaries. That is the same thing with a lot of these plants. And what we're talking about today are perennials, and perennials can be more easily moved. But when you get into woody plants or trees, moving those is not really an option. So think about where you're going to site it, plant it accordingly to the mature size, and then also think about the water needs of the plant. So you don't want to put a water-loving plant in the middle of your cacti garden. That really doesn't make sense because you're going to not have the ability to water as you need. So using the appropriate plants is going to reduce the amount of pests and disease that you have, the need for fertilizer, the need for pesticides, and the need for pruning. So again, plant selection is more than what color is it and when does it bloom. There's a larger aspect to it. And it is so important to group like plants together. This photograph is a real landscape. This was down in the Phoenix area, which you know is even drier than parts of Colorado. And what they did is they planted these cacti and the yucca with a tall fescue lawn. So tall fescue is a cool season grass. It has no place in Arizona, especially during the summer months. And then you have the saguaros, which take like 2 inches of water a year versus tall fescue, which needs 20 inches of water a year. And so when this landscape was installed, this was shortly after it was done, it looked beautiful. But you are going to overwater one or underwater the other, and you have to think about those balances. In this case, the saguaros were perfectly sited for this location. Perfect plant for this location. The tall fescue was the glowing air in this situation. So hydrozoning is grouping plants with like water needs together. You will figure this out. You will get to know your plant material, and you'll understand how things are grouped. Now, you might have the ability, if you have a drip irrigation system, to adjust the emitters or the nozzle types to either give a plant more or less water following establishment. The big thing, though, is hydrozoning is going to lead to healthier plants. You're not going to lead to root rot. You won't get plants that die out or die back because they are grouped with plants of similar water needs. And plant for the long term. I can't emphasize this enough. Really, once you put a plant in the ground, it should be there permanently. That is its home. That's where it will stay until it needs to be divided or outgrows its space in the case of a perennial. So, you know, plant for color, plan for season of bloom, and make sure that you have all of these factors going into a 3 or 4 season garden that can give you some of those aspects. And then also consider plants that are locally adapted for your own region. So if you're in Ohio or Oregon, you might have programs that have been promoted by your nursery or greenhouse industry that are good plants for your region. Here in Colorado, we have the Plant Select program, which I will talk about in just a minute. But these are plants that have been researched and demoed in gardens across the state of Colorado, and they have been then released as good introductions for most of Colorado landscapes. For resources, there is no shortage from the CSU Extension website. I will tell you that CSU's Extension, our goal really is to overwhelm you with information. We're very good about that. So if you say, gosh, I really need some recommendations for trees, we will send you 6 fact sheets on trees and then let you wade through the list to find a good option for your own landscape. But we have fact sheets, we have Plant Talk Colorado, we have the Master Gardener Garden Notes, we have the Cohorts blog, which you may have seen when you signed up for these classes. And then we have other resources where we've partnered with industry or Denver Botanic Gardens to then publish information. If you're looking for resources on the best perennials for Colorado or the ones that have done well in the CSU trials, you can go to the Trial Garden website. If you're looking for annuals that have done well, you can go to that same website. So there's a lot of different information just from CSU alone. And then when you combine that for other resources from the green industry or from Resource Central or from Denver Water, there's a plethora of resources you can take advantage of. Plant Select is our local plant introduction program, and these are plants that have been released for the Mountain West or the Arid West. So these are plants that would do very well in Wyoming, out to Utah, Montana, down into the southern Colorado area, Arizona, New Mexico. And the great thing about this program is that before any plant is released, it has gone through a fairly rigorous research process where it has been demonstrated in multiple gardens and multiple sites in multiple areas across Colorado, and feedback is given every year. And then these plants, the best of the best, are then released into the Plant Select program. So this program has been around for over 20 years, and each year they release somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 8 to 12 plants. And so the website is plantselect.org. There's designs available. I really love the plants feature where you can actually search for plants based on your criteria. So you can search for plants based on height, whether they're a perennial, what color bloom they have, when they bloom, are they pollinator friendly, and you can then get that giant list of plants down to a select few. So this is an amazing resource. A lot of the local garden centers and retailers do have Plant Select plants. It is unlikely that you would find these at the big box stores or hardware stores. So this is a cooperative program with CSU, Denver Botanic Gardens, and then the Green Industries of Colorado. Here's a few aspects of garden ideas. And so if you are stumped, if you have an area that you just don't know what to put there, you can then use these resources. All of the plants have been introduced through the Plant Select program. You can modify as you wish. Lauren Springer-Ogden is a local landscape designer. She's she's a big deal around here. So she actually designed several of these that you can then use. They're free to download, and then you can buy the appropriate plant material. Okay, so are there any questions, Amy, that I haven't addressed or that haven't been addressed? You're on mute if you're talking.
I think we're good.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I think we're good. Bernie just answered the last one.
All right, thank you. All right, so let's talk perennials. Here we go. First, let's say, what is a perennial? So a perennial is a plant that returns year after year. That makes sense, right? It's a plant that comes back, it regrows from the crown of the plant, and then performs for you year after year. There are some very long-lived perennials. Think about peonies. They live for decades or centuries. And then we have some perennials that are considered to be short-lived, where they might only have 3 to 5 years in the garden, but they might have then the tendency to reseed. So they continue to grow, but the original plant may not be what you planted. They are herbaceous, and so that means they have soft, fleshy tissues. They're not woody, and so they're not like a tree or a shrub. And then they do regrow from the crown of the plant. Perennials tend to have a set bloom time as well, and so it's usually measured in weeks, not months. This would differ from annuals, which are a one-year plant. So annuals are our petunias and our coleus and our geraniums, where they will bloom for you consistently throughout the entire summer. Perennials usually bloom for a few weeks. And all perennials take time to establish. So the little fun saying is that the first year they sleep. So the year you plant it, you probably won't see a lot of growth. The second year they creep, and so they're forming their underground roots and they're getting established. And then the third year they leap. So when you plant a perennial, don't expect a lot from it for the first couple years, but during year 3 is when you'll see a lot of impact. And this will vary depending on what you plant. Some perennials, you plant them, they get up and go. Others will take this time to get established. The first one we're going to talk about is penstemon. It's also known as beard tongue, and it is an absolutely wonderful plant. I love penstemon, and I will say that I've really only become familiar with this because I've lived in Colorado. So penstemon, most of them will bloom from late spring to early summer. They will have different leaf types, they will have different foliage types, and they come in a variety of different colors. They can range from just 12 inches tall up to 36 inches tall, and there are hundreds of penstemons that you could consider buying. Here's the thing, is that penstemons may not all be hardy to Colorado, so selection is important, and that's where the hardiness zone really does come into play. So if you were to look at a regular plant tag, it might say hardy to zone 5. In the Colorado Front Range region, most of us are going to be in zone 4 to 5. What that means is that you shouldn't plant anything that's a 6 or above, but you can plant things that are zone 2 or zone 3. So you can always go colder where they'll be more cold hardy, but as you get warmer, that's when you're going to run into winter hardiness issues. Now, depending on your garden, you might have a pocket that's going to be a little bit warmer, and maybe you do some extra care to mulch it during the winter months, and that will work out fine. But only you are going to know that, and only you can decide if you're going to chance or risk the chance of planting this plant. Penstemons are attractive to both hummingbirds and bees, so they're a great pollinator plant, and they tend to be deer resistant, which is also really good. They do better in what we call lean soils. So they don't like soils that are overly amended or heavy with compost, and they really don't want extra fertilizer and things like that. And they also need full sun. So they are going to do best in full sun. There are many native penstemon that you can consider buying as well. And then a couple that I want to showcase are selections from the Plant Select program. So Red Rocks is one, named for of course, our natural area outside of Morrison. And it's a beautiful plant. This one's a little bit taller, about 2 to 3 feet tall, and just profuse blooms. Absolutely wonderful. Again, it's a pollinator plant. One that I have found to do extremely well in my landscape, and I will say that my landscape is a tough place to be. If you don't like neglect, you usually don't do well in my landscape. We'll just put it that way. But Carolyn's Hope was named after one of the breeders, his wife Carolyn, who was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so it is that breast cancer pink, which is absolutely beautiful. Really a nice petite plant. Mine only gets to be about maybe 14 inches tall, and it's a great one. And proceeds from part of this plant go to the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, which is a nice added bonus. And another penstemon is Pike's Peak Purple, very similar to Red Rocks in the shape and height. Of course, we just have a purple bloom, and you can see how the bees are just loving this plant. It's a perfect pollinator plant because of those tubular flowers. Our next plant is salvia, also known as sage. Salvia, of course, we have for culinary purposes, but these are all going to be ornamental, so they would not be good eats. I would not recommend eating any of them, but they're all going to have that familiar sagey smell, so that kind of rich aromatic scent to them, which is very nice. They are in the mint family, and so when you hear about plants in the mint family, you might be like, oh my gosh, there's no way. Now, the mint family is notorious for having, of course, the true mints, which are crazy invasive. If you've ever made the mistake of planting mint in your garden and it's had water, you will have mint for life. Fortunately, the salvias, for the most part, are not invasive. So they are in the same family, but they don't have those characteristics. What we generally recommend, and this was actually something Amy brought up in one of her presentations I listened to, is to have a mixture of both penstemon and salvia to have this long period of bloom. So the penstemons will bloom a little bit earlier, the salvias will come on after the penstemons, and with that you will get at least 2 months, if not longer, of bloom time. Salvias are very tolerant to most soil types, so if you have a heavy clay or a new landscape, they should do just fine for you. The thing is do not overhead water. So this is one that if you're getting it established, make sure you water at the base or have it on drip irrigation. It's another pollinator plant, does tend to be deer resistant, and there are so many types of sage. So Furman's Red is up in the left. We have May Night, I think, in the right. We have different types of sage. Some of them have beautiful silvery foliage, which is just even nice as a foliage plant. This is Windwalker, so this is another Plant Select introduction. Again, the sages will pair very well with the penstemon, so consider doing that one, but really a nice cardinal red flower. Wild Thing is more of a kind of magenta-y pink purple. Again, another great plant, and all of these love full sun. They're drought tolerant plants, and they're really great for the Colorado landscape. May-night salvia is a classic. It was a perennial plant of the year many, many years ago. But what's nice is that it has a really nice compact habit. It's almost like a mounded plant. What's also cool is that this plant will get a second flush of blooms if you cut back the first set once it's done. So you'll get a smaller set of blooms late in the summer, early fall, if you do cut it back. So just a great plant. I actually just planted a couple of May-night salvias in my landscape, and they're doing really well. The next plant is hyssop or agastache. You may say it in a different way. We'll just call it hyssop because that's the common name. This is another member of the mint family, but again, not invasive. Another wonderful pollinator plant. So bees and butterflies, hummingbirds love the hyssop. And there are many Plant Select introductions. The hyssop can get up to 24 inches tall. There's a few shorter varieties that you could consider getting. And what I love about hyssop and what my beagle maple loves about hyssop is how they smell. So they have these really wonderful fragrant leaves. And so there's some that smell like anise. There's some that smell to me like bubble gum or almost like a bubble mint. And they're just incredibly fragrant. So I just planted a Coronado hyssop not too long ago, and Maple the Beagle, who loves anything fragrant, rolled on it immediately. I was planting it, and then I walked away to grab the hose to water it in, and she almost essentially destroyed the plant. I was so angry. So now it's happily growing with a tomato cage around it, so Maple the Beagle cannot roll in it, but they do have this really nice scent. So I would say if you like scented plants, it's one that's best planted along a sidewalk, so that as you walk by, you can brush against it, you can get that really nice scent. This is one of the perennials that we consider to be short-lived. So it will last for a few years, but then it tends to reseed, and it's not an invasive seeder. That's a big thing to point out, is that it will just gently reseed, but some of the plants don't live for decades on end. So if you happen to lose yours after a few years, that's a very normal feature of the hyssop. And in the spring, what you'll do is once the new growth is about to emerge, you would just cut back the old foliage from last year. Very easy. A couple Plant Select introductions. Coronado Red, kind of a peachy red pink color. Again, this plant looks enormous in this aspect, but they're only about 2 feet tall. And again, they'll all have a very similar flower shape and that nice scent as well. Sonoran Sunset is more of a magenta pink, again, gorgeous, covered in blooms. This is just a really nice perennial. And you'll notice that for a lot of these, they're planted in a gravel mulch or a rock mulch. Both will work. I have mine planted in a wood mulch, and they have done very well. So they do prefer a little bit more of a well-drained soil, not a super heavy clay. But a rock mulch will work, but I have also found them to do well in wood mulch, but they are not watered following establishment. So that's a big thing. Too much water for these guys can lead to them flopping over. It can lead to root rot. And so really monitor that soil moisture. And then Coronado is the one that I just planted. And I just think it's absolutely gorgeous with kind of that peachy colored bloom. And it's blooming now. I planted it and it's blooming now, which is really nice. And it has almost a gray-green foliage. Moving on to the hummingbird trumpet. This is Zauschneria, and hands down, one of my absolute favorites. I adore this plant. It is so tough. And so if you have the hottest spot in your landscape that is with the driest soils and toughest conditions, try planting hummingbird trumpet because I think it's going to do well for you, and it blooms constantly. So as the name implied, it does attract hummingbirds, which is really nice, and this is a ground cover. So it's this beautiful mat of kind of grayish green leaves, and it just fills in spaces, and it does attract hummingbirds. I haven't seen them in my garden, but you know, the world is young, maybe I'll see them in the future. And it has these orange trumpet-like flowers that bloom for weeks, if not months, all summer long. It blooms constantly. So it's about ready to bloom now, and it will bloom well through September. This is an example of my hummingbird trumpet. This is my front landscape bed, and so we have the driveway just in front, and then we have a sidewalk on the other side that leads to my front door. And this was one little 1-gallon plant planted about 6 years ago, and it is awesome. I love this plant. It takes over, it grows really quickly in the spring, and one secret that I do in the spring is I take my lawnmower, and that's how I cut it off. I use my lawnmower to do a lot of pruning back on perennials. Maybe not the best thing, but I do use it in this aspect, and it responds every year. So this is easily filled in, probably a 5 by 5 square foot area. There's obviously a couple other plants in there, but this plant is ready to pop, and I would say we'll start seeing blooms on it next week. There it is in full bloom. It is absolutely gorgeous, and those flowers will self-shed, and then it will continue to bloom well into the fall. So it can take full blazing sun. If you have a little bit of part shade, that's okay. And then again, just water it the first year to get established, and then you can let it go. Really only needs light pruning. I do mow mine down because I find it gets a little bit ungangly by the end of the season and after going through a winter month. But this one is really cold hardy up to zone 3. So this would grow well into Wyoming, up into northern Minnesota, and those areas as well. So this is a really awesome plant. I can't say enough good things, and it is a plant select introduction as well. Bee balm is kind of a classic flower. To me, bee balm comes in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and it's an excellent pollinator plant. I absolutely love bee balm as well. It can get very tall, up to 4 feet, with the blooms on it, so make sure that you're siting it appropriately. They are kind of bushy, but it can get some height. So it's not one necessarily for the front of the garden border, but maybe one for further back, maybe against a fence, or just as kind of an accent background plant as well. Bee balm will bloom from July to September, but it really peaks right away in that the hot summer months in July. If you do cut it back, you might get a second set of blooms, but they're not going to be quite as good as the first. It does need a little bit more moisture. I will say that you will have the best blooms if it gets a little bit of regular water. Doesn't mean it needs to be on the drip system 3 times a week, but I would say if you can water it probably a couple times a month, it's just going to be happier and you will have the best blooms again. It is deer resistant and another great pollinator plant. To me, so bee balm is also in the mint family, and to me, bee balm smells like Fruit Loops. So maybe you like Fruit Loops. I personally love them, but it has a really kind of fruity, almost citrus scent. I think it's just a great plant. It can spread. I haven't seen mine spread, and I think the spreading is correlated with overwatering. So if you do have a heavy hand that you water a lot, you might get bee balm spreading into areas that you don't want. So that's where it's really best to leave it a little bit more on the dry side. And I will recommend that if you are buying bee balm, to look for powdery mildew resistant varieties. This is a plant that is absolutely notorious for getting powdery mildew, which is almost like that white chalky powder on the leaves. It's an actual disease. But they have been breeding bee balm to have more powdery mildew resistance. The other thing is make sure it is not crowded with other plants, because that can increase the humidity and then increase the severity of powdery mildew. Powdery mildew is not usually a killing disease. It just looks unsightly. I get it every year on my peonies, but it is related to the humidity and crowding and a little bit of cooler temperatures as well. So just know that about bee balm. Look for resistant varieties. Marshall's Delight is kind of an old classic. It's been around for a very, very long time. And again, you can see the height on some of those flowers. I think they're so cute. They almost look like little sea urchins. And again, all of the bee balms will have similar characteristics with the flower type being pollinator friendly and of course, smelling like Fruit Loops. The Garden View Scarlet is a little bit more of a reddish color. It's also a little bit shorter. This is a newer introduction that has come out in the last couple of years and has better powdery mildew resistance, so you can look for that one. And that's it on that. So I will take just a quick pause and check in on Amy and Tony, or if they're able to keep up with questions.
I think we have kept up with everything. If we didn't answer your question and we missed it, just retype. But yeah, I think we're all in good shape, Allison.
All right, thanks, Amy. Hop flower oregano is, oh gosh, I already said that hummingbird trumpet was my favorite. Okay, can I have multiple favorites because I absolutely also adore hop flower oregano. I've only recently found this in the last couple years, and I am completely obsessed with this plant because it is so cool. And the flower, those are the flowers right there. They're so different than anything that you have in the garden. And so if you're familiar with hops, the vine, the pops, of course, are what you make IPA with and your other beers. It looks like a hop, and it's actually a true oregano. It is not an edible oregano, so don't go snacking on this one. That's a really bad idea. But the flowers have these beautiful kind of pale green with these lavender accents. And it is awesome when it is in full bloom. It is absolutely outstanding. This is a plant that you want up front and center in your garden so that you can enjoy it. So this is hop flower oregano. It's technically a ground cover. And what I noticed this year is that my hop flower oregano is about calf high. So it's probably 16 inches high right now. It's getting ready to bloom, but it's not quite there. So it's a little bit taller than a traditional ground cover, but it would still fit into the diminutive stage of being a shorter plant. So this is a prolific bloomer that has this really unique flower bract. And again, look at that coloration. I mean, things that make you go, ooh, this is it. It will bloom from summer to fall. And the great thing is that those flowers will be retained. They'll actually dry down, and they'll provide a lot of winter interest as well. So this is a great 3-season plant. It will look amazing if you position it over a rock wall or on a trellised bed, or somehow have it where it can cascade down over the edge. It is absolutely amazing. Everyone, please go and buy hop flower oregano along with the hummingbird trumpet because it's so good. And it is a plant select plant. So it was introduced in 2004. Reaches a height of 14 inches. Mine's a little bit taller because it's extra happy because I love it so much. And this is definitely a full sun plant. Pollinators love it. And for those of you battling deer and rabbits and other critters, it doesn't seem to be chewed upon by those animals. So if you have those in your life, it might be another good one. There it is. You can see it draped over the sidewalk. Mine is draped slightly over the lawn. And the other benefit is that the flowers can be cut off and then used in cut flower arrangements. And so if you're growing zinnias or dahlias and you want a little bit of zhoosh to those cut flower arrangements, you can use hop flower oregano. And again, it is a beautiful dried plant. So you could also cut those flowers off, hang them upside down, and then use them in dried flower arrangements after they've dried. And this plant is crazy drought tolerant once it's established. So again, for all of these plants, they will need regular water to get established. And then after that, you can cut back the water and give it basically nothing, and they will be happy as can be. Coneflower is one of the classics of our gardens. This will grow in almost every single climate. Obviously, it's a native to much of the United States. And the cool thing about coneflower is that there's been a lot of breeding, and so we have some very neat cultivars that can do really well. Coneflower is very, very cold tolerant up to zone 3. And so it is a great plant for colder climates or areas that might not get some of the warmth that we do in other parts of Colorado or elsewhere. So the name is Echinacea purpurea. Echinacea comes from the Greek for hedgehog because of the prickly flowers that you can see. So obviously we have reflexing petals that kind of droop down with the center of coneflower. It is a full sun plant and very heat and drought tolerant once it's established. It's also a really nice pollinator plant. So the straight species, the Echinacea purpurea, is going to have more of this true purple color. Everybody's familiar with coneflower. I think everybody can identify it pretty well. The plants can reach heights of 4 feet. I have several coneflowers in my landscape, and I can attest to that they get kind of tall by the end of summer. They also, what I have found is that they can reseed. This is one that I may have regretted planting. I have found coneflowers in many aspects of my landscape, and they find places where the mulch has blown away, and then they seed and they come up, and they are, I will say, difficult to remove. That said, they have also found places where no plants like to grow, and so I have left them in many cases. But I do have to do some thinning of the coneflower every single year. So just be aware that if you plant the straight species, they can reseed, and I wouldn't call them invasive, but I would certainly say that you will notice them. They do look best when they're naturalized together, and so having just one coneflower here and one coneflower there, that's not really where they shine. So they will look best if planted in more of a naturalized setting with multiple plants, or even almost like as a group of plants together. That's where they're going to look good, because then you get this profusion of blooms like in the photograph, and you will have pollinators just going crazy to pollinate those plants. Great cut flowers, as you probably know, deer resistant, and then my recommendation is to leave the seed heads through the winter, because small birds like finch and other things will actually use the seeds for food and nutrition during the winter months. Plus, it does give you some interest. It's maybe not the most attractive interest, but you're doing two things by giving your garden some structure, and then you're also helping feed the birds during kind of the bleak winter months. A couple of introductions. Kismet raspberry was one of the coneflowers that was in the CSU perennial trials. And a couple years ago, this was named Too Good to Wait. And so Dr. Klett and his team do evaluations of these plants, and it's a 3-year perennial trial. And this was one that just knocked everybody's socks off after the first summer. So Kismet raspberry, it's a whole series of coneflower that you can consider. But that pink is just beautiful. And on very nice dark green foliage, you can see how nice and erect those flowers are. It's a good one. So look for Kismet raspberry in your local garden centers. White swan is, of course, a white colored coneflower. So coneflowers do come in different colors. We, of course, have the traditional purple, but we also have a white as well. And white swan is probably the most common white coneflower that we have. And if you just love all the colors, then go for Cheyenne Spirit. This was a great introduction, and it obviously kind of has those tones of the West. If the West could be classified in colors, it would be those really just wonderful sunsets of the reds and the oranges and the yellows. And so this is one where if you just can't decide, go with this, because it will cover all of your colors and work well with any of your current landscape plantings. So Cheyenne Spirit is another one to consider. The sedums and the stone crop, this could be a lecture in itself. I could talk about sedums and stone crops all day long because they are simply amazing. So these are plants that absolutely love hot, dry weather. So 95 degrees today in the full sun, the sedums, the stone crops, our succulents are just absolutely loving life. And the best part is that these are also plants that will tolerate poor rocky soils. So again, not a plant that wants rich, organic, heavily amended soils. It is one that will do best on leaner soils and not a lot of care. Sedums are really one that once they're established, just leave them alone. Don't touch them, don't look at them except to admire, but just leave them alone because they will find their place in your landscape. Sedums can range in height from, great ground cover plants to up to 24 inches tall. It's a very large and diverse plant family, and the flowers will attract bees. They are definitely a pollinator plant and resistant to deer as well. So get them established and then just leave them alone. A few of the species have these incredible blooms, and they tend to be on the plants that are a little bit taller and a little bit larger. So the ground cover sedums will flower, and I find, to me personally, the flowers detract from the interesting foliage of the sedum itself. But something like this, the Autumn Joy sedum, it's going to be a more tall, erect plant, and then they get these huge pink blooms in the fall, and it is absolutely spectacular. So you have these pink blooms atop of these fleshy green leaves, and it is just something. It is really, really wonderful to have late blooming things that go into the fall months. There are sedums that will gently reseed. So this is one that has escaped from its bed, wherever that might be in my landscape, and taken up residence right by my air conditioner. Great, love it. You know, one less crabgrass plant that I have to pull or spurge as it goes on. This is Angelina. I will talk about her in 1 second, but Angelina is the current darling of the sedum world. She's amazing in every way, shape, and form. And she has taken up residence along my little shed that housed my lawnmower. And you can see she's growing in the worst possible conditions of rock. I think there's actually landscape fabric under this small section, and has never seen any water except for what nature provides. But she's happy and she's healthy, so that's cool with me. Sedums are also great for your hypertufas, which are those rock containers. So this was one that I purchased at the farmer's market a number of years ago. It overwinters beautifully in this container. It never leaves this spot. And a lot of these sedums are incredibly cold tolerant. I just water it every once in a while during the winter months, and it continues to grow. Sedums are really, really impressive plants. One that you could consider is turquoise tails. This was a plant select introduction, and there you can see it with the flowers, which are out of focus. I apologize for that. But in this case, this is where I think that the flowers detract from the actual plant. So, and sometimes I will prune back plants and get rid of the flowers. You don't need to have them flower for any reason. If you don't like them, you can remove them. But I just like the look and the color of the foliage of this plant. So that's turquoise tails. Angelina you saw earlier, but Angelina is amazing, and she is lime green during the summer months. And then as the days get cooler and a little bit more crisp, she turns into this beautiful russet orange. Look at that. That is just outstanding. So there's not a lot of perennials that get this wonderful fall color, but Angelina is definitely one of those. So consider her. She does reseed. She moves throughout the garden, but she is not at all invasive, and it's incredibly easy to pull her up. A lot of the sedums are very shallowly rooted, and so it's easy just to pull them up or replant them or what you need to do. And they grow so well, so they will fill in gaps that you don't have. So Angelina, she's reseeded into parts of the flagstone patio that I have. She's gone into other areas, and how she's escaped, it still puzzles me, is how she moves around, but she's a good one.
Hey,
Autumn Fire. Oh yeah.
I'm going to stop you real quick because we're having this side conversation about sedums that you can plant in stone pathways. Mm-hmm. Have you found that Angelina to hold up pretty well to foot traffic, or do you think it's?
Ooh, no, I wouldn't. Okay. Actually, I would. You know, they do reseed into those pathways. This is a great question. I would say because the leaves tend to be really fleshy, mm-hmm. It's not going to tolerate heavy foot traffic. Like if you stepped on it by accident, I think that's okay, but not back and forth, or dogs. I don't think it could take dog traffic either.
Okay. All right, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. If someone has something different that they found one of the sedum species to have good tolerance to traffic, type it in and let us all know. One of the upright ones to just give a nod to is Autumn Fire. This is very similar to the Autumn Joy that I showed earlier, just a little bit different flower color. I think it's also a little bit shorter. And there's Frosty Morn, which is variegated, which is also beautiful. So a very, very pink, almost whitish pink blossom set. This will, of course, again, bloom in the late fall. And with that variegated foliage, just looks wonderful. So Frosty Morn is another good one to consider. Okay, let's talk about ice plant. I wish I could grow it. Full disclosure, I cannot grow this plant for the life of me. And I know that I'm going to see 22 messages appear in the chat as to, oh my gosh, Allison, this is the easiest plant to grow in the entire world. For me, it is the holy grail. I have tried. So I've lived in my house for over 10 years. Every year I plant Delosperma in different spots thinking that this is the location, this is the summer I'm going to have success with Delosperma because it's quote unquote so easy to grow. For those of you who grow it, I admire you. I really do. I clearly do not have the green thumb when it comes to ice plant. This is what it looks like because ice plant is simply amazing, and there are so many wonderful cultivars that you can consider. It is a ground cover, it's a succulent, and it blooms like crazy all summer long. So for me, it's the holy grail. For you, it's probably like a weed that gets out of control. But the flowers are daisy-like, and we have actually introduced several ice plants through the Plant Select program that come from areas of South Africa. So it's a very interesting relationship where some of the places where we're hybridizing and breeding plants are so different geographically than Colorado, but have a very similar climate. Once ice plant is established, it is incredibly heat and drought tolerant. Okay, so that's a really good thing. It does need well-drained soil, and I think that might be where I suffer, is maybe I don't have well-drained soil, or maybe I think I do, but I'm not getting it established appropriately. I don't know what it is, but anyway, it will grow for me through the summer and then it dies in the winter, and it could come down to an establishment thing. It could come down to the fact that it is too dry in my garden during the winter months. It could be that I use wood mulch as opposed to gravel, which I think it prefers. If you get it established, good for you. It is going to grow beautifully. It will form this wonderful carpet of flowers for you, and you can really go crazy with some of the selections. So this is the latest Delosperma that was introduced last year called Fire Spinner. And if that doesn't just stop you in your tracks and knock your socks off, I don't know what will, because it is absolutely outstanding. So I was at the garden center this spring, and there was Fire Spinner looking so lovely, and I did purchase one. So I have it planted. It is growing. I will say it hasn't died yet, which is pretty good for me. So maybe I can report in a few months that I still have Fire Spinner, but that color combination is simply outstanding. Lavender Ice is another one introduced from Plant Select. Very, very pale lavender, and you'll see that the centers of these flowers usually have a darker color or a contrasting color to the petals. Another beautiful ice plant. I thought I had a couple others. There's Allen's Apricot, there's Table Mountain, there's so many different ice plants, and I would say that the Plant Select program has done a great job of promoting this plant throughout the state of Colorado, and they have many introductions, and I would also say that they have many introductions. So just know that all the ice plants are the same culturally, so if you can grow them, by all means, go ahead and do that in your garden. Let's move on to lavender. This is very versatile, so this could be a culinary herb, it could be an aromatic, and then I just grow it as a wonderful plant that does incredibly well in Colorado. It is one of the few herbs that actually prefers more alkaline soils, which is what we have here in Colorado. It is drought tolerant, it loves full sun, and truthfully, Colorado is perfect to grow this plant. It loves the hot, dry, rocky regions of the Mediterranean. That's where it's native, and Colorado provides a lot of those same conditions. So full sun likes a leaner soil, so not something that's heavily amended. And spring planted lavender is going to have the most success with winter hardiness. So there are years where the lavender will die back completely or die back a good amount. And so this was one winter where there was significant dieback on some of the lavender. And for me, in my garden, I had to do a very severe prune down to just a few leaves. Fortunately, it is taken off and doing really well, but it will suffer significant dieback during the winter months, and you do have to do a very heavy prune in the spring. It will need a little bit of supplemental water, maybe once a month, maybe twice a month, to get it to look good. If you're not concerned about flower production, if you're fine the way it is, it will do well without any sort of supplemental irrigation. But if you do plan to harvest the flowers for either aromatic purposes or you're growing it for culinary purposes, that is one thing you'll want to consider. The two types we can grow are the English lavender, which is hardy to zone 5, and that's where borderline hardiness can take place. You can get it to do a second set of blooms if you cut back the first. It will not be as prolific the second time, but you will get a few blooms. And the ones you want to select are all named after English words, or they're very English sounding. So Hidcote, Munstead, Goldbird, Mitcham Gray, those are all good cultivars that you could consider with the English types. Lavandin is a hybrid cross between English and another type of lavender. These are also very hardy plants. They tend to be larger, but they will only have one set of blooms, and they bloom a little bit later than the English types. And if you're getting into lavender production, they will have more oils than the English type. Cultivars for this include the Grosso, White Grosso, which actually has a white bloom, and then I think I spelled that wrong. I think it's Provenance is what it's supposed to be. So lavandin was also very, very hardy. And if you want to grow lavender, these are the two types. Most of my plants are the English type, and they have done, again, very, very well. Full sun, hot conditions, very drought tolerant, and other than a little bit of dieback in the winter months, they do perform incredibly well. Now there is a variegated lavender called Platinum Blonde, which is a fabulous name for a plant. Maybe you love it, maybe you don't like it, but I feel that the foliage of this plant is where it's at and not necessarily the bloom. I don't know if I like the bloom with the variegated foliage. This was in the CSU 3-year perennial trials, and it was released as one of the better lavenders that do well. I did not have it survive in my garden, but again, do not measure success based on my gardening talent. But Platinum Blonde is one you can find it. The ones you do want to avoid are the Spanish lavender. You'll find those at a lot of the box stores. They have a fatter, poofier flower head, and they are not going to be hardy to Colorado. So that is something. You can absolutely grow them, but know that they are going to be an annual that you'll just have in your garden for the summer months. Wee1 is pretty much the cutest thing on the face of the planet. So this is a miniature lavender. It is a perfect rock garden plant, and this was a plant select introduction. So if you have a rock garden or you need a border plant just to take up space, Wee1 will fit the bill. It is very, very hardy. It's hardy to zone 5. It is more like an English lavender, and again, so cute. Maybe 8 inches tall, maybe a little bit less. They have it growing here in Windsor at the Treasure Island Garden and some of the crevice gardens, and it is absolutely outstanding. So it is perfect, absolutely perfect. Chocolate flower does smell like chocolate, believe it or not. And I will say I was so excited. I went outside my front door this morning and I sniffed, and there was this chocolate scent in the air. And 2 years ago, I had planted chocolate flower because it was one of the cheapo deals at the garden center. And so I bought it and I just spit in the ground, and I totally forgot I had it. And you know that whole, the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. Absolutely true for chocolate flower. So it is blooming and it smells like chocolate. It is awesome. It is a Colorado native and it is absolutely wonderful. So there is a very nice chocolate scent in the morning hours. And so if you grow this plant, make sure it's somewhere where you can enjoy that. It really does best with minimal water once established. So it is one that you plant, you get it established, and then you ignore it, and it can get up to be 20 inches tall. It doesn't live a very long time, and so it does have the capability to reseed in the garden, which is nice. And so it can take over, not take over, but it will reseed and find its own patches. I think I've probably pulled it thinking it was a weed in the past, and so that is something that just know that it might turn into a chocolate flower and not necessarily one of those weeds, but it's a great little plant. It does need good drainage. Again, minimal water once established, and then cut back in July. So after it has that set of blooms, cut it back in July to encourage it, to prevent it actually from sprawling. So it won't kind of flop over. It doesn't have the strongest stems, and then it will send up a second set of blooms, which is quite nice. But seriously, it smells like chocolate. It is wonderful. I bet many of you have this plant or have smelled this plant, and it's an absolute delight. Love it. Prairie Load Sundrops is a beautiful yellow blooming, I would call it more of a ground cover, maybe kind of a a mid-range perennial. It's another native prairie species and just absolutely covered in yellow flowers when it's in bloom. It's amazing. It does best in hot, dry conditions. And what's also nice is that the habit of the plant stays more compact. And so it doesn't get sprawly, it doesn't get leggy. So this is another really nice plant for a hot, dry area. It does well in our soils, which are naturally alkaline, and again, prefers more lean soils. So I wouldn't amend this at all. And it is best, again, spring planted. So like the lavender, planted in the spring or even now to make sure that it does have time to get established. Going into the winter months, because it might have a little bit of cold hardiness issues, make sure to mulch it well. So take some leaves or even some wood mulch and just kind of nestle it around the crown of the plant to help alleviate some of those fluctuating temperatures that can occur. This is a really good practice. If you do any fall planted perennials, that is also a good practice. So obviously at the end of the summer, there's a lot of good deals at the garden centers. You can totally buy and plant perennials in the fall. Just know that they will need some extra protection because they're not going to be quite as established, and also give them some regular water during the winter months to get them through, especially if we're having a very dry winter like we've had the last 2 or 3 years. So what I'm going to end up with are grasses. So Amy is the self-professed ornamental grass queen, so I do not want to steal her thunder, but I think we both share a love for the grasses I'm going to talk about. So the first is Blonde Ambition. This is a blue grama, and it is an introduced cultivar of our Colorado native blue grama grass. And I think blue grama is just cute because the seed heads sit up above the foliage. They look like eyelashes. They might look like mustaches, whatever you want to describe it. It is just cute. So it can be used, the straight species can be used as a lawn grass, often paired with buffalo grass, which is how it cohabitates in the eastern parts of Colorado on the plains. This is an introduced cultivar, so it's going to be a little bit taller, up to 30 inches tall, and full sun, hot, dry, full sun. That is the big thing. The seed heads on this are going to be more of a yellowy green, so it was specifically selected because of the difference in the seed color, the seed head color, than the straight species. And again, it is resistant to deer. So there are those seed heads, little mustaches, eyelashes, just adorable. That's what it is. Here's the thing about Blonde Ambition, is that it is a very popular grass. And so if you start to notice this in the landscape, you will notice it everywhere. Here in Fort Collins, in the Timnath area outside of Costco, they have a long bed of Blonde Ambition. It will reseed. And so you will find clumps of this growing in, again, areas where nothing else will grow except for weeds, but they're not going to be true to type. So if you let them go, it's probably going to be a type of blue grama, but it's not going to be Blonde Ambition. So you can remove them or you can leave them, but just know it's not going to seed true to type. But this is a warm season grass. It's super low maintenance. All you have to do in the fall, or actually do nothing in the fall, but in the spring, cut it back. The seed heads last pretty much through the winter months, which is really nice, again, adding to winter interest. The next one is Standing Ovation Little Blue Stem. This is a specific cultivar. So Little Blue Stem is another native to Colorado and the plains, and so there's many different blue stems. It's also a cousin, if you will, of Big Blue Stem, but this is Schizocurium. That's the genus. It's just fun to say. And this is a warm season grass, so very similar to blue grama. It's a warm season grass. It won't green up until usually June, depending on where you're living. And this is one that, again, does well in poor, dry soils. Perfect plant for that really tough location that you have in your landscape. Full sun, absolutely. The nice thing about Standing Ovation, the name kind of says it, where it keeps this really nice, tight, compact habit. It only gets to be about 36 inches tall with the seed heads, but it keeps this really nice form. So it doesn't get leggy, it doesn't widen, it doesn't spread out, but it keeps this beautiful, compact, upright form. The great thing about Standing Ovation, and actually all of the blue stems in general, is the fall color. So this ornamental grass really does it because it has great summer appeal with the blue-green foliage, and then as the days start to cool off, it gets kind of this purpley red burgundy color, and it is outstanding. And this color stays with the grass during the winter months, which is really, really nice. The seed heads remain. They give not only winter interest, but they also provide food for the birds. So standing ovation, very, very cold hardy, and again, one of the few grasses that has beautiful fall color. Here's a graphic of what it looks like during the growing season. So again, warm season, so it won't really start to do much until June-ish. Then you have July, August, and then October with that outstanding red fall color. Panicum is switchgrass, and switchgrass is one of the ag crops that they're using now in Iowa, but these are introduced cultivars of switchgrass, so panicum. What I love most about panicum are the seed heads, because to me they look like explosions of fireworks dancing above the ornamental grass. Look at that, it's just like a plume. It's beautiful. So there's many different ornamental introductions. I'll show you a slide of some of the ones that you can consider. It's a larger grass, so the others were only about 2 to 3 feet tall. This one's up to 5 feet tall, so it does need a little bit more space. The nice thing though is it doesn't spread outward. It really keeps a nice narrow habit. And there are selections of the panicum or the switchgrass that have great fall color. It is another warm season, so it will take a little bit to green up in the spring. What's great about switchgrass is that it doesn't lodge or flop over. That's a big thing with ornamental grasses. We usually leave them up during the winter months for interest, but there are some that just don't do well with heavy wet snow or wind, and so they tend to flop over. Panicum, though, will keep its upright form, and it retains some of that seed head as well. So again, it might get red fall color, maybe yellow fall color, but it is a great plant, and I like it because it provides some nice structure in the garden. I like things that are nice and tidy, and it provides some nice structure. So here are some cultivars to consider. The one featured is Northwind. The University of Minnesota has done some introductions and breeding on several different ornamental grass species. They introduced Blaze, Little Blue Stem, that was one of theirs. They also have introduced Northwind. And again, you can see that really nice compact habit, but again, a taller ornamental grass of 4 to 5 feet tall. Shenandoah is one that I have just found to be incredible because it gets, again, that really nice kind of blood red fall color on the tips, has those pink seed heads, and has all the characteristics of this grass. This was a really fantastic introduction, has done really well. Again, full sun after it's established, doesn't need any water, and will continue to thrive. So it's a great one. Heavy Metal has more of a bluish green foliage color, similar seed heads, kind of the pinky seed heads, but again, all of these have different characteristics that you can consider, but the basics of the plant are all the same. So in summary, just 2 slides left. Plant a variety of things and make sure that when you are planting that you're doing it with a lot of ideas in mind. So do I need something with longer bloom? Have I planted all yellow flowering plants and I need a different color? Think about the water needs and things like that. And then when you can, leave plants with winter interest standing in the garden. So this of course includes our ornamental grasses and our coneflower. The Angelina sedum is going to have some nice red color well into the winter months, and it usually retains that color throughout until spring. And when you're looking at maintenance of plants, I know I didn't talk about this, but there's not a lot that goes into perennial maintenance. The big thing is that if they start to outgrow their space, or in the case of ornamental grasses, they start to die out in the middle, then it's time to dig them up and divide them or transplant them. It's up to you to decide what to do. Essentially, the rule of thumb with that is that if you have spring blooming perennials, so things that bloom in the earlier spring months, probably they'll be done by June, you'll want to do that after they bloom. So this is when you start to do iris, peonies, things like that. If they bloom later on in the summer, you can divide them just as they're starting to show some growth in the early spring months. So you're looking at doing this in March and April. But again, if you're not sure or if you screw up, these perennials, for the most part, are incredibly tolerant to abuse. We'll just put it that way, where they can usually bounce back and recover from some of the mistakes that we made, and you just go with it. It's fine. If it's convenient for you to divide whatever it is in July, divide it in July. Just know that it's hot, and if you're transplanting them, they do need some extra moisture, and you treat them like a newly planted plant. And then should you clean up your perennials in the fall or wait till spring? Again, that's up to you. There's a couple rules of thought that if you leave them in the garden, they might collect snow and help with moisture to the crown of the plant. It might actually insulate the crown. If you don't like the look of it, if it's too messy for you, if flopped over iris are not what you wanted, then go ahead and do that in the fall. I feel like a lot of times gardeners are very tired when fall comes around, and doing fall cleanup can be kind of a task. But again, it's up to you. It's how you want to maintain your garden. I will say that do leave your ornamental grasses until the spring, just because they are best cut down in the spring months right as growth is emerging. With that, I will take any final questions. If you do have questions for me, you're welcome to email me. I noticed that someone recorded this presentation, so thank you, whoever did that. We will get it uploaded to YouTube, and for everybody who registered, they will get the link along with my handouts, and you're welcome to share those. And please, again, join us next week. I am happy to take questions. Amy, Tony, if there's any that I missed.
All right, so I'm just finishing up in the chat here. Let's see. The only one oh, well, they're still coming in. Oh, someone asked if you could talk about peonies really quickly.
Sure. Peonies are great. The thing with peonies is that once you plant them, leave them alone. Peonies do take quite a bit of time to get established. So when you purchase them from the nursery, replant them at exactly the height that they are in the container. Not too tall, not too slow, or not too low, not too tall. They have to be planted exactly, because they really throw a fit. And then they don't really bloom for a good 4 to 5 years after transplanting. If you have some in the garden, I wouldn't move them unless it's absolutely necessary. They just don't like to be messed with. There are some peonies that are hundreds of years old and they are happy as can be. So they do well, but don't expect a good set of blossoms until a few years after planting. And then water is normal. They do like a little bit more moisture. They're not quite as drought tolerant as some of our other plants, and they do like a little bit of afternoon shade as well.
Great. All right. Let's see. Someone asked about, could you please talk about portulaca and if they will pollinate common purslane? I don't know if we know the answer to that, but I know Allison knows about portulaca.
I do love portulaca. So they're both portulacas. One would be considered a weed, more so. The portulaca that we know of has really colorful pinks and yellows. I don't know if they would pollinate each other. Tony, do you know the answer to that? They're in the same genus?
They're different species.
Okay,
Yeah.
different species. So, but once you have portulaca, you will always have portulaca. It reseeds freely, and you will have it. And I found it to do very well in flagstone. Again, it's not super traffic tolerant, so maybe in a place that doesn't get a lot of foot traffic, but it is one that just finds its way around your garden. And it is an annual, that's the big thing, but it reseeds very, very well.
All right. And then, there was a question earlier. Let me just make sure all the videos are off here. There was a question earlier about comfrey, and I'm not that familiar with this plant. Someone just planted it and it's kind of getting out of control. They're cutting flowers off as they see them, but any ideas on comfrey or how to slow it down or calm it down?
I think it's an herb, right?
Well, it's an invasive species list in some states,
Oh,
particularly the Northwest. Yeah, it spreads through its roots too. It can be aggressive like the mints. So I think if you want comfrey in your garden, grow it in a container or.
I think it's too late. I think they've already planted it. So
Yeah.
I suggested maybe mowing it, just try to, keep it down. Maybe
That's probably not going to work. You're going to have
Okay.
to dig and remove and be very aggressive with it. It's a very nasty, invasive weed in some states.
All right. Well, maybe you and maybe we can talk to David offline about that.
And I will say that if you're finding some of these perennials to be invasive, definitely check your cultural conditions. A lot of these can get far more aggressive in spread if they're given too much water. So really, I can't emphasize enough, really monitor how much water you're giving them.
Yeah. All right. And then let's see, tulips. So here's the question, would tulips follow the same rule as irises to transplant them after they bloom? So in the summer?
Yes, that is correct. So you will want the tulips to have their foliage dry down to the brown. So you want to make sure that they fully die back, and then you can dig up the bulbs and divide them and then replant them.
Yeah.
Yes, and probably I wouldn't expect tulips next year for the most part. Tulips are kind of fickle. They seem to come and go as they choose, but not reliably.
I would agree. I think they're going to need another season to build up enough energy to give you good blooms. So I agree with that. And then CJ asked, if we're going to continue these classes on Zoom even after COVID. And CJ, we just had this conversation before we let you all into the webinar today that we are considering doing another series, but we're going to take a little break for July and early August, and then maybe pick back up. What did we decide, Alison? Mid-August, maybe?
Yeah, something like that. I think we all have like county fairs we need to suffer through. And
Yeah.
then we'll come back. So we'll come back and maybe we'll do like a troubleshooting to start things off to see what you have seen in your own gardens. And then we'll go into some of the fall topics as well.
Great, yes. We're getting a lot of please do, yes, yay, and thanks, and all of that. So this has been really fun for us too.
It has been fun. And John, I just wanted to address your coneflowers. They will do well in part shade. I haven't found a place where coneflowers don't do well. I'm looking outside and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have so many coneflowers. So yes, they will do fine in part shade. You might not get the bloom that you want, but definitely the foliage will grow.
All right. I think that we got all the questions. I hope so. That should be it.
Okay.
And all right, I was recording, so I will get that sent over. I did miss your very first slide, but that's okay. But we'll get that recording posted as well.
Yep. So again, everyone who registered will get the recording and the handouts, and our IT staff can catch up with us. So yes. We appreciate you being here, and thank you. Good luck. Join us next week for Amber.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right. Have a great day, everyone. Enjoy that heat.